On November 12th of 2012, a student at Grinnell College scored 138 points in a game of basketball. His name was Jack Taylor, and on that day he shattered the NCAA record for the most points in any single game. And while a 5'10" filmmaker putting Wilt to shame seems somewhat incomprehensible, Jack Taylor's record night was actually somewhat of an inevitability. You see, at the time, Grinnell employed this man, David Arsenault, as its head coach. And Arsenault was the basketball equivalent of a mad scientist. He conjured up the Grinnell system, a wild set of strategies more similar to a 5th grade recess than organized collegiate basketball. Don't get it twisted, this strategy was employed specifically with record-breaking nights in mind. So much so that Grinnell specifically marked games on their schedule for attempts at rewriting the record books. So yeah, a D3 college team decided to go buck wild for a decade or two and put a bunch of records into the history books. And to be honest, it's a pretty hilarious interpretation of the game of basketball. But it's not like any NBA team would ever do anything similar. Surely no NBA team would employ a mad scientist head coach whose game plan was a recklessly fast-paced no defense and chucking one bad shot after another. And they definitely wouldn't run their offense through a 5'10" point guard who was encouraged to shoot way too many three-pointers. The NBA is serious business. There's no way that would happen.
Tonight, the rejuvenated Rockets take on Paul Westhead's Nuggets. This Denver team showcases a fast-paced, up-tempo style with an emphasis on shoot, shoot, shoot. It's the Rockets taking on the downtown Nuggets next.
Meet Paul Westhead, the protagonist of our story and the architect of the bastardization of basketball. Now you may think that the coach responsible for the NBA's most ridiculous team was some random guy that they pulled off the street, but that couldn't be further from the truth. This is every championship head coach since the 1960 season, sorted by how many years they spent as either an NBA head coach or assistant at the time that they won the title. Most coaches accrue years of experience before they make it to the summit of the basketball world. Larry Brown spent a quarter of a century as a head coach before finally winning his first championship in 2004. Mike Budenholzer spent 17 years as an assistant and 8 more years as a head coach before winning his. So that begs the question of who had the least experience when they made it to the mountaintop. Pat Riley won his first ring in his 4th season. Larry Costello did it in 3 with the 1971 Bucks. Bill Russell won 2 championships in his 2nd and 3rd years as a player coach with the Celtics. And here's Paul Westhead, who in 1980, 14 games into his first year as an assistant coach, took over the Lakers as the interim head coach and then led them to the championship. The only championship coach that can match that level of inexperience is Steve Kerr. But unlike Westhead, Kerr spent 3 years as the GM of the Suns before transitioning to coaching. And he was, actually hired as a head coach before the 2015 season began. So yeah, Westhead was a highly accomplished head coach before he was even officially a head coach. And his tenure with the Lakers was quite the wild odyssey. It only started because the previous coach, Jack McKinney, was hospitalized due to a bicycle accident. It gave Pat Riley his first job as an NBA coach. And it ended when a dispute with Magic Johnson led to the star requesting a trade out of LA. After Lakers owner Jerry Buss wisely decided to fire Westhead instead of trading Magic, the coach moved on to Chicago, but after just a single 28-win season, he was fired by the Bulls, and by just a year, missed the arrival of a rookie by the name of Michael Jordan. It would take 8 long years, but Westhead did get one more shot as an NBA head coach. And with that one last chance, Westhead was going to make quite the impression. I promise we will get to that lasting image in just a second, but before we do, we need to visit a little bit of basketball history in the Mile High City. When the ABA spun up in 1967 as a competitor to the NBA, the Denver Rockets were one of the teams that joined the league. 7 years later, anticipating a merger, the Rockets changed their name to the Nuggets, since the NBA already had a team in Houston with the Rockets moniker. And in 1976, the Nuggets were one of 4 ABA teams that joined the NBA. After 3 years of mostly unspectacular basketball and declining win totals in the hands of legendary head coach Larry Brown, and 2 more years of mediocrity with his replacement Donnie Walsh, the Nuggets hired a new coach by the name of Doug Moe. And it was the seemingly innocuous decision to hire Coach Moe that unknowingly set the Nuggets on a path that leads to me telling you this story some 40 years later. You see, Moe's teams weren't like the conventional Nuggets of years past. They played fast, and I mean really fast. From when Moe took over in 1980, the Nuggets led the league in pace for 9 straight seasons. And Moe's teams were good. They made the playoffs in all 9 of the full seasons that Moe was at the reins. Over that span, they employed a quintet of legendary Nuggets: Fat Lever, David Thompson, Alex English, Kiki Vandeweghe, and Dan Issel. This team was fun and exciting, and they gave us a little bit of an appetizer of the shenanigans to come, including playing in the highest scoring NBA game ever, in the form of a triple overtime thriller that saw the Nuggets lose to the Pistons by a score of 186 to 184. But in 1990, despite 9 straight playoff berths and a trip to the Western Conference Finals in 1985, Moe was fired. Enter Paul Westhead. If Doug Moe's Denver Nuggets had maxed out the speed dial, well, then I'm not exactly sure how to explain what was about to ensue. The guru of Go had arrived, and he was ready to push the tempo to a level that the NBA had never seen before and hasn't seen since. This is the pace of every team in the NBA from 1987 to 1995. Coach Moe's Nuggets aren't too hard to spot. Here they are in 87, 88, 89, and 1990. So which one of these dots in 1991 do you think is Paul Westhead's first season with the Nuggets? Where is that stupid little dot hiding? The 1991 Denver Nuggets were not only the fastest team in this decade of seasons though, they were the fastest team in NBA history. Just like Dave Arsenault and the Grinnell Pioneers, Westhead prioritized playing fast over all else. The Nuggets played a full court press all game long. They went for every offensive rebound in lieu of getting back on defense, and they shot a million threes, well before it was the fashionable thing to do. I know the NBA community tosses around the word generational quite a bit, but I really mean it when I tell you that this team did some generational chucking. Not only did they lead the league in field goal attempts per game at 108.1, but the gap between them and the second place New Jersey Nets was 1.5 times the size of the gap between those second place Nets and the last place Utah Jazz. Unfortunately, due to the wild nature of the early NBA, the Nuggets can't quite claim the title of the greatest chuckers ever, but they are, by far and away, the greatest chuggers since color television became mainstream. So, unsurprisingly, the Nuggets led the league in scoring at 119.9 points per game. And while that's only good for 28th all time, it's more than any other team that played in the 90s, 2000s, or 2010s. So who were the players that powered this scoring outburst? Well, 8 different Nuggets averaged over 10 points per game. And aside from Walter Davis, who was winding down his Hall of Fame career, none of these guys are particularly notable names. But there is one guy here whose name I think you should remember, and that's this man, Michael Adams. If Paul Westhead was the mad scientist, then Michael Adams was Frankenstein's monster. At just 5 foot 10 inches tall, Adams was a 3rd round pick by the Kings in the 1985 draft. The man was literally drafted in a round that doesn't exist anymore. In his rookie year in Sacramento, Adams barely saw the floor, got waived in December, and ended up playing the rest of the season in the CBA. But after showing some promise with the Bullets in 1987, the Nuggets decided to give Adams a shot as the team's starting point guard. Fast forward to the 1991 season, and here's Adams leading the Nuggets in scoring at 26.5 points per night. This season made Adams one of only 3 players listed under 6 foot to average more than 25 points per night. joining Calvin Murphy's 1978 season and Isaiah Thomas in 2017. Adams was also unique because he utilized the three-point line more than anyone else in the early 90s. And in 1991, he, by himself, attempted more threes per game than 2/3 of NBA teams. But he wasn't just a prolific scorer for the Nuggets. He was also their best playmaker, averaging over 10 assists a night. That combination of volume scoring and distributing is remarkably rare. In fact, only 7 players in the course of NBA history have averaged more than 25 points and 10 assists a game across an entire season. To put that in perspective, 10 players have recorded 50, 40, 90 seasons, 9 have won at least 3 MVP awards, and 10 have scored 70 points in a game. And yet, here is Michael Adams, who, by the way, wasn't even an All-Star in this season. Now, if we're being fair, there's a pretty damn good reason that Adams was omitted from the All-Star festivities, and I'm tremendously sorry to report this. But that reason is that the Nuggets were astonishingly bad. They won only 20 games and finished with the worst record in the league. The problem is, we've been looking at the Nuggets per game stats, and boy have they looked good. But the issue with per game stats is that they have as much to do with pace as they do with the actual thing that they're measuring. If we remove the Nuggets' ridiculously fast pace by looking at a per possession stat like offensive rating, well then we can see that this team that led the league in points per game was actually the 7th least efficient scoring team. But that wasn't even the reason that this team stunk. The so-called Denver Nuggets had no D. This team gave up 4 more points per game to their opponents than any other team ever has. Their offense-first, defense-optional approach to the game of basketball led to some of the funniest scores the NBA has ever seen. This is every game the Nuggets played in 1991, sorted by the number of points they gave up. Now, I could sit here and go through every single number, starting at 100, and tell you about how the 1991 Nuggets allowed at least that many points more than any other team in history, but for the sake of your time, let's just skip to the big numbers. They allowed at least 140 points 24 times. No other team has done that more than 14 times. They gave up at least 150 on 9 occasions. The team with the next most has 5 such games. And they gave up 160 or more points in 4 different games. No other team in NBA history has done that more than once in a season. The 1991 Nuggets can proudly say that they gave up 4 of the 8 highest scoring regulation games since they joined the NBA in 1976, including a game on the 10th day of November in the year 1990, where they set the record for the most points allowed in any regulation game by allowing the Phoenix Suns to drop 173 points on their heads, a record which they still hold nearly 35 years later. And don't get it twisted, these mammoth numbers aren't just a function of the astronomically high number of possessions that they played, because if we look at this defense on a per possession basis, we find that they had the 2nd worst defensive rating of any team before NBA offense began to explode in 2019. This team, this beautiful crossroads of circumstance, was an unsustainable amalgamation of incompetence. And as much as I wish that I could tell you that the Nuggets ran it back, figured out the details, and turned this team into a winner, they didn't. Paul Westhead took a radical gamble in the name of upending the stylistic foundation of 1990s basketball, and you've gotta give him credit for having the gumption to go all out. But with the disappointing record at season's end, the Nuggets looked to rebuild. First, Denver said goodbye to Frankenstein's monster. As soon as the season ended, Michael Adams was dealt away to the Washington Bullets in a trade that gave the Nuggets an additional lottery pick. But this departure was a triumphant one for Adams. Sure, his numbers were never going to be as good as they were with the Denver Nuggets, but free from the stigma of the NBA's most ridiculous team, Adams made the All-Star game in his first season in the nation's capital. Unsurprisingly, the Nuggets looked to use their draft picks to focus on defense. And in a fitting turn of events for the franchise, they struck gold with the 4th pick by drafting one of the greatest defensive players of all time. In his very first NBA season, Dikembe Mutombo almost single-handedly took the Nuggets from the league's very worst defense to its 13th best, and he joined Adams in that 1992 All-Star game. He did it under the tutelage of coach Paul Westhead, who stayed to coach the Nuggets for another season. But despite a reversion to sensibility and the individual brilliance of their new franchise player, the 92 Nuggets could still only muster 24 wins. And that meant the Guru of Go's fate was all but sealed. Following that 92 season, Westhead was shown the door, and he never got another chance as a head coach in the NBA. So yeah, the 1991 Nuggets were a wild science experiment that almost instantly turned into a dumpster fire large enough to warm the Denver winter. In the grand scheme of things, this season is completely meaningless. It's just an anomaly floating around in the vast catacombs of NBA history that found its way to notoriety. This team was utterly ridiculous and entirely terrible, but boy were they a ton of fun.